Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the watch party for the Stratford Festival 2017 production of Romeo and Juliet. My name is Scott Wentworth. I directed the production, and I am here with Antoine Yared and Sara Farb, who play Romeo and Juliet, two of my favorite people in the world. How are you guys?
So nice.
Hi.
It's so great to see you. These days, it's so great to see anyone's face, but it's especially great to see your faces.
You too.
In many ways, it doesn't feel that long ago, but in other ways, it feels like several lifetimes.
Yeah.
To remember our experiences together. Obviously, Romeo and Juliet is perhaps Shakespeare's certainly most famous examination of love. But one of the ways that our production approached it, as I was remembering and looking back through my notes, was examining the culture and the society in which Romeo and Juliet lived and met and had their experiences. I was remembering from the beginning when Chorus, who in our production was played by the beautiful Sarah Dodd, comes out, and it may have been the first spoiler in literature where she essentially says, oh, and by the end of the story, these two will commit suicide. So we know that we're on that sort of trajectory. So I remember that we started some of our conversations about the play kind of looking at the last scene and in a weird way working backward, that the last image that Shakespeare gives to his audience is of a generation of older people essentially burying their children. And I know that certainly infused my thinking about the play, making sure that there was a societal context for the love affair and the relationship between Romeo and Juliet to grow out of. One of the things that we talked about a lot was the feud kind of became, between the Capulets and the Montagues, kind of became an image for an unsustainable social system. It was tearing the social fabric apart. It was literally killing people. But at the same time, it was providing through fines, money moving into the ruling class's hands, so that there was very much a very particular context for the relationship. We meet Romeo before we meet Juliet in the aftermath of the latest outbreak of violence. So for you, Antoine, it's always great for me as to kind of host these little interview things, because it's rare that a director gets to actually talk to actors about what it was like to do the stuff. Even though I feel like we collaborated very closely in our rehearsals, this had to be owned and inhabited within your bodies. So Antoine, where is Romeo when we first meet him? That first scene, as I said, it's after the first outbreak of violence that we see. It's almost as though the violence is affecting his very language. What was it like beginning the story that way? Did the social context mean anything to you? Was it just another part of a larger process? What was that like for you?
Yeah, definitely. The language that he uses at the top of the play, in a way, reflects where he's positioning himself in regards to his community. I think Romeo feels disconnected with the world around him. He's completely overwhelmed by this perceived heartache that he's going through, which is very real to him. And in a way, that's all that really matters, is how he's experiencing this pain, this unrequited love that he's dealing with. But at the same time, he's feeling disconnected from his community. The violence that's happening in the outside world is reflected by his own inner turmoil. And to me, he feels like a bit of a lost soul, a youth that's sort of not finding his place within the larger context. But even with people of his generation, I think there's a disconnect.
Yes, that was certainly very palpable in your performance. That's that sense of a lost soul, which I was certainly very grateful for watching you guys put these performances together. We talked about this a lot, that there is a tendency to, on a certain level, romanticize this play. It's become so much a part of our culture, perhaps even sentimentalize the story. I mean, for you, Sara, when we meet Juliet, another one of the consequences of this particular society is that women, particularly young women, you might even say a child, she's not 14, are commodified. They are treated as essentially part of an estate and part of a monetary system. And when we first meet Juliet, indeed, they are planning her sort of entrance into society as a marketable commodity. She's going to be shown off to the marriageable young men of her community. And there is a notion that she's going to be married off to Paris young Paris, who is related to the ruling class. And I suppose we should remind our audience watching that the Capulets and Montagues are rich mercantile families. And certainly in Shakespeare's time, that was one of the new social forces. Money was coming into essentially this middle class. And they depended on the ruling class for a sense of social importance, social connections, in the same way that the ruling class depended on them for a ready flow of cash. So that's how we meet our heroine. What was it like for you to begin your journey with this character within that particular socioeconomic circumstance?
In our production, Juliet enters writing things down. Immediately, we all agreed how very intelligent she is, how very perceptive and thoughtful she is, which we see on full display in the balcony scene where she's working these thoughts out loud in a confused but very intelligent way. In her first scene with Lady Capulet and the nurse, two very powerful women in her life, and on the stage, she barely gets a word in edgewise. And I think we watch her move from sort of a passive participant in her life into this very forceful and controlling person, and taking control of her life in the way that the adults around her are failing her. And that, I mean, that happens for a very long stretch in the second half of the play. We watch Juliet make these decisions in spite of all of the things that the adults are trying to impose, which shows enormous growth. Like, you know, the play only takes place over a few days. So to meet Juliet as this, we're constantly reminded of her age in that first scene, to just grow into this logical, searching brain. I think watching that growth from the very, but it being indicated from the first moment of her intelligence, of not being this like hopeless romantic little ingenue, of just like, we see that she's going to make choices.
That's great. That's great. Thinking about the language of the play, it is Shakespeare right at the beginning of discovering perhaps his powers of imagination and the power of language. There's rhyme in the play. There's sonnets in the play. There's prose. It is an over exuberance, if one could characterize it that way, a literal explosion of language. But in watching it and in thinking about it, both Romeo and Juliet, as you were mentioning, Sarah, Juliet keeps her cards pretty close to the chest in that first time we see her. She doesn't say much. We don't quite know how she feels about any of the stuff that the adults are planning. And although Romeo speaks more, Antoine, there's also a sense in those early scenes with Benvolio, and even later with Mercutio, that the language almost seems to, that he almost uses it as a kind of wall between him and his contemporaries, to sort of keep his heart safe, perhaps. He lets it out right before he goes to the party and eventually meets Juliet, when he describes he tries to describe this sense of doom that he feels, but it's rejected by his community, and so off he goes. Anyway, even the first meeting of Romeo and Juliet is a shared sonnet. Talk about that first meeting and how you encountered that language, because I mean, literally, it's, I do one line of a sonnet, you do the next line of a sonnet, and it was, although I think a modern audience infers what's going on, certainly Shakespeare's audience would have been aware that you guys were essentially creating a song together. What was it like exploring that and indeed performing it?
That particular scene moment was really interesting to explore, in that it had many iterations. And I think what we ended up choosing to do with it was at the heart of what makes their relationship unique. Meaning, we decided that we would be aware that we were creating a sonnet together. In that moment, that we were aware that there was a meeting of two souls who, in that moment, are able to create a piece of art A sonnet, a poem speaks to intelligence, it speaks to emotion, it speaks to the soul. And this is where they're meeting in their first moment. They're actually able to connect on an intellectual level, on an emotional level, and on a spiritual level. I mean, it's something to be able to create a sonnet, which is a very strict poetical form, with someone that you've never met before. I think that is a real meeting of two souls. And to me, the fact that they're able to create this the first time they meet is at the seed of why they can have such a tragic ending.
Mm.
I think it's such a rare and special thing to connect with someone on that level, that to feel like you might lose it or that you've lost it, that the hope goes with that. There's nothing left because
Yeah.
it's so hard to find that again, to be able to connect with someone on these three levels,
Yes.
which feed the individual, the self. And so, yeah, I thought that that was one of my favorite moments in the play. And we discovered that, like, I think during previews, we decided that um, we would we would help the audience understand that this was very self-aware.
I remember having that conversation with you. I can't remember the precise details, but the counting
It
of
was in
the
room.
meter. Was that you?
Yeah, we came. I think I came to your dressing room, and I
Yeah.
think it was in late previews, and I was like, I think we should try.
Yeah.
And we had like we played around with it,
Yeah,
but
it's the best. It's so self-conscious. So the playfulness of the moment of understanding what it is that we're doing and to demonstrate the ability to keep up. And that's incredibly powerful. So which mannerly devotion shows in this, because his hand is up. We've talked about palms. It's like it was a stroke of genius.
It was a beautiful moment, and for both of your characters, it allowed you, at least for me watching it, it allowed you guys to be incredibly active in what could easily be a sentimental moment, an emotional moment, a simple moment. It allowed for all sorts of levels of complexity for those of
Yeah.
us who were watching it, and that was a great gift. So they create this work of art. They create this highly constructed work of art. Romeo doesn't want to go home, climbs over a wall. Juliet doesn't want to go to sleep. She opens her window to get some fresh air, perhaps, appears on the balcony. So there we are in the famous balcony scene, probably one of the most famous scenes that Shakespeare wrote, certainly one of the most famous openings to a scene. We even if you don't know Shakespeare, you know that she starts it by saying, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? And he says, what light through yonder window breaks? I mean, it's in our cultural bones. And that can be both a challenge to navigate because it's an actual scene. It's not just a bunch of famous quotes. It's a little like beginning, to be or not to be. It carries a kind of weight. What was it like navigating that scene in our production?
whatever apprehensions or anxiety that like an actor might have, that I might have had, knowing that we were about to like start exploring such an iconic scene, the sense of play that was in the room and the connection that I shared with Sarah prior to the beginning the rehearsal process sort of took care of that daunting task. I felt so connected in the rehearsal hall and just exploring those moments with her, moment to moment, just receiving what she was offering and then making an offer in response took the weight off of how loaded these lines can be. And I think that is what carried us throughout the rehearsal process. And then the entirety of the production is that I felt so connected to her and so safe
Mm.
that I felt like we had the confidence and the permission to just be present and respond to each other every night.
Mm.
Yeah.
And therefore, we were able to make some really fun discoveries in that scene without trying to be clever.
Right.
It was such a real discovery with each other and with you, Scott, in the room, that instead of trying to reinvent the wheel with that scene, I think we were able to distill it to something that felt authentic
Hmm.
and youthful without having to play at it.
Yeah, it felt authentic to our personal relationship too, which is very close. And yeah, Scott, you allowed for so much. We did that scene so many times in so many different ways, and you were so hands off, and it was some of my favorite rehearsing moments in my career, was being able to just strip this thing from its preconceived notions, from these characters from their preconceived notions, of just finding out about what they're saying to each other, what they're dealing with internally, what they're perceiving from the other. Like, I remember you suggesting Antoine just sit down and watch, because Juliet has all these long thought spirals. And it's just like, there's no space for Romeo to speak. She's just working it out, and he's just watching it all happen. And there's so much talk that towards the end, when they decide to part for good, the silence that comes, and the birds indicating that it's morning. It was just to just like look at him. He was just like lying there on the stage, and it's just so, to be able to build to that was so real. And apart from when we're lying dead, it's the longest we have together. Our scenes together are not plentiful, and so having that anchor in the middle of the show was just, it was a really good way to feel what it was going to be like that night, where we were coming from. We would always check in after. It was my favorite memories.
It's a beautiful piece of dramaturgy, because, as you just suggested, you guys don't get to spend a lot of time together, but that's also characteristic of the play. The scenes are short.
Yeah.
Time is constantly being mentioned there, as you guys said earlier. The events of the play take place only over a few days. People are constantly surprised and draw our attention to it. Your father is like, "What day is it?" he asks at one point, and is surprised to get the answer. It's only Monday. My God. Reminds me of how I feel now. And then Shakespeare says, "This scene's going to be 20 minutes long."
Mm-hmm.
There you go. And so it does feel, from the outside watching it, that we have spent the entire night with these two people, and time is taken out of the equation until it finally comes back in with the birds at the end. And you go like, okay, we have to obey time eventually. It's soon going to be morning and the next day, and time will continue. But for a while there, it's taken out. So, the play kind of divides in half. Halfway through the play, the death of Tybalt and the death of Mercutio. Not that the first half has necessarily been a comedy, but there is energy, there is life energy. We see these two young people coming together. Energy is available. The second half of the play, the tone changes dramatically. Your relationship, Romeo with Friar Lawrence, alters. Those two mirrored scenes are very different. The one has rhymes and lots of energy, and then in the tragic mirrored scene, communication is almost denied. A similar thing happens with Juliet and her nurse. And of course, we follow Juliet's journey. More stage time is given to that in the second half of the play, as she becomes, in a way, more and more alone, leading to that big soliloquy. Particularly for you, Sarah, what was that navigation like, encountering the tragedy?
I really tried to ask the questions for real with the nurse. Gallop Apace exists still in that first play.
Mm-hmm.
So when Juliet enters, expecting a continuation of this high she's on, and that just gets steamrolled by the new play, this new tragedy. It's navigating this new world. It's asking the questions of the nurse, who comes in discombobulated, confusing Juliet. She thinks that Romeo is dead, but then finds out that he killed Tybalt. And already, I think Juliet has experienced an identity awakening, just a reinforcement of who she is in meeting Romeo, and taking charge of her life and deciding to marry him and being impulsive, but with good reason. And all of a sudden, she's a married woman who needs to deal with a very adult situation, an unimaginably dividing personal situation, and she needs to determine where her allyship is. And of course, it's with her husband, who's brand new. She's been Tybalt's cousin her whole life. And it's a very clear decision to commit to him no matter what. And I think all of that happens in real time. I think understanding that she's capable of this kind of reconfiguration of her identity to identify as a wife and see what that means, and to cut ties with the family she was born into and understand who her real family is. That's a huge transition. And it happens in a course of scenes, and the stakes keep rising until that final soliloquy. And it's just a sequence of discoveries and making decisions on the spot, which acting is, of course. It's just,
Yes.
all of this is happening to her, and she has no experience at all with any of it.
Watching you do it, it was also, I was very, very much aware that perhaps for the first time in literature, we were watching a young girl. I use that noun purposefully. That we keep stressing how young she is. She's practically a child, but now she's married. Now she has to take on what her culture says are adult responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
I know I encouraged you guys both to consider the real causes and repercussions of suicide, that again, this was not a romantic or sentimental or necessarily inevitable gesture to end a romantic tragedy. Romeo is given a little more stage time to articulate this. Your journey through what I can only say from the outside looked like an encounter with despair. What was that like for you, Antoine, to navigate that last movement of Romeo's?
Well, I think it harkens back to what I mentioned earlier, in that I think Romeo feels a disconnect off the top of the play. There is a certain inherited bias that his generation has absorbed from the previous one. This hate for the other, this violence, and he sees it around him. He sees how it's affected his friends. He sees how the adults around him are unable to prevent that hate from being passed on. And in meeting Juliet, he sees a glimmer of hope. It's like, you're granted the possibility of a life that you had only dreamed of before. And when that gets taken away from you, yes, despair sets in. But I also think he feels like he owes it to her and to himself to continue this journey with her through death. They made vows to each other. And I think in deciding to commit suicide, he's rectifying some of the wrongs that he's done, the mistakes that he's made, and he's choosing not to abandon her in that moment.
Mm. Your Juliet's suicide, her thinking is not given the same kind of time by Shakespeare that Romeo's is. Again, time has entered the world. Romeo's scene seems to, in his head, which I feel like we are encouraged to enter in that scene, time is kind of not there. He's in eternal time now. Juliet wakes up and she's in real time, and she hears people outside, and the world is on her. What was that negotiation like? Because that is quick.
She gets some space to work things out during the soliloquy, at least. She works through scenarios of, maybe this is a poison and I'll die. I think there is a part of her that's made peace with the fact that this could very easily lead to her death. And so the immediacy of the choice, yes, it's a snap decision, but there has been some space to work through her feelings about suicide as it pertains to Romeo and as it pertains to love and death versus living in this world. I'm not sure if given the space, she would work it through the same way. I think ultimately, yes, she would end up dead. A part of me thinks she might reason that she's alive for a reason and he's dead for a reason. But the speed and decisiveness, I think we've seen her this whole play grapple with swirling thoughts, and finally she lands on a thing. She has become this decisive, controlled, clear-headed person. And, you know, right before the suicide, she tells a distraught and bumbling friar to get out. Yeah, I think it makes sense. I think that it's a perfect companion to Romeo's long and beautiful and thoughtful.
Yeah. This is, you know, just in closing, this is one of the few plays where the two protagonists are dead for a really long time while other stuff goes on.
Mm-hmm.
And indeed, Juliet, you know, you are in your death of sleep, but you, Sarah, got to hear what Antoine had to say every night. Both of you got to hear. You got to hear what she had to say. You were lying there dead, but of course, Antoine got to hear her commit suicide. You got to hear the end of the play while you were lying there. And I think a lot of audiences, you know, we forget, we think you're dead. So you know, we don't even go there. But that's a peculiar aspect to enacting these plays. Did hearing Antoine speak to you have any effect on Juliet's action? What was that like? You know, the play was continuing without your voices. Was it weird?
I never really thought about that.
I mean, in a funny way, you know, I've thought about, like, well, you know, what if I were to die? What would my funeral be like? Like, what would people say after I've gone? And we get to sort of experience that in that play. And of all the things that could happen after their death, the conversation that happens between their families is basically the best case scenario. So there's a weird sort of not satisfying closure to it, but at least it ends on a hopeful note.
Yeah, it's certainly not. The play doesn't tie itself up neatly. I mean, you know, what we discovered was you have to speak the truth, and people have to hear the truth, and people have to understand their culpability. And even when they think they weren't being intentional, they were. People have to hear that, which reminds me of the world we find ourselves in now. I am always amazed that these old plays continue to speak to us, but also how a play that maybe sometimes we think of as this is a play about teenagers and love is about that, but also about many other things as well. And you know, perhaps watching it tonight, we will reflect on where we are at the moment in all of our conversations with our communities. I thank you guys for participating in this. I'm very much looking forward to seeing the movie again. I would say to our viewers to enjoy going on this incredible journey with Antoine and Sarah as Romeo and Juliet. We hope you enjoy the film tonight, and we thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Enjoy.
Hello, I'm Anthony Cimolino, Artistic Director of the Stratford Festival of Canada, and welcome to our live viewing party for our 2017 production of Romeo and Juliet, directed by Scott Wentworth. Now, I don't need to tell you anything about this tale of teenagers who defy their family's mutual enmity. It's probably the most famous love story ever told. But I will tell you this, go get some Kleenex. It's a really great production. Now, if you'd like some insights into the production itself, tune into our Creative Concept series, in which our Director of Education, Lois Adamson, speaks with the director of this production, Scott Wentworth, and also the production's lighting designer, Louise Guinon. Then this coming Saturday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, tune in for our live virtual Meet the Festival, in which you'll have an opportunity to ask questions of the cast. Meanwhile, if you'd like to hear some reminiscences from a former Romeo and Juliet, why not tune in to the latest installment of Grant Wynne Davies' series In Good Company. In this one, he'll be speaking to Megan Follows, who was our Juliet in our 1992 production, and also to her Romeo, who was, well, me. If you're just tuning in now, you've missed the pre-show chat that Scott Wentworth had with his Romeo and Juliet, Antoine Yared and Sara Farb. But don't worry, you can watch it at your leisure anytime in the next 3 weeks during the run of this film. And this time next week, we'll have our live viewing party for the last film in this series, our 2015 production directed by Chris Abraham of The Taming of the Shrew. And don't forget, you can also rent or buy our latest installment in our Stratford Festival on Film series, The Merry Wives of Windsor. We could all use a good laugh right about now. And in this delightful play, William Shakespeare delivers. Just go online to the Cineplex store. Finally, if you're having any difficulty viewing the film tonight, just try refreshing your screen or changing the resolution, or go to the Film Festival FAQs at the bottom of our homepage, stratfordfestival.ca. Now let's go to Verona, where the Capulets and the Montagues are once more about to begin brawling in the streets, where a love-struck Romeo has not yet met the girl that will really change his life. Ladies and gentlemen, join us for William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet.